Yeah. Okay. So we will continue with where we left off last time, and we'll kind of, this is still a continuation of lecture 7, but we'll finish off now today some of the properties of submodular functions, and we'll then talk about the submodular information measures, and we'll kind of connect information theory and submodularity, right? So this will be the second part of today. Okay. So this has kind of been a kind of long-standing open question which people have been trying to understand, is that do you draw analogies from submodularity to be like to be kind of similar to convexity, or is it similar to concavity, right? So it turns out that actually submodularity is related to both, and has certain properties that are related to both and certain properties that are related to neither, right? So they're neither submodular nor supermodular, or sorry, they're neither convex nor concave in terms of certain properties of submodular functions, but in other properties they are more like convex or concave, right? So we'll go over some of these things. So it turns out that there are certain convex aspects of submodular functions, right? Some of which we'll cover in this course, but some of which I'll just superficially mention and point you out to some papers related to this. So the convex aspects of submodular functions is basically the fact that you actually can come up with an efficient convex extension, and we'll kind of cover this in the next lecture. It turns out that you can also write down certain duality like properties of submodular functions. You can actually compute a dual of a submodular function, which is akin to a Fenchel dual, the way you have for a convex function. And it turns out that submodular functions can be efficiently minimized, right? So you have efficient minimization algorithms for submodular functions. We'll talk about some of the algorithms a little bit in the next lecture when we talk about optimization, right? Also partly towards the end of today's lecture, but also in the next lecture, right? So the convex aspects of submodular functions is only half the story though, right? So the other half is that you have certain properties of submodular functions which are like kind of concavity, right? So one property is the diminishing returns property itself, right? So diminishing returns basically says that as and this is kind of more akin to a concave function, because you take the gain of an element of basically adding an element early on, right? And this gain will be larger than the gain of adding the same element later on, right? So essentially the gain of f of a union s minus f of a, which is f of, this is sometimes written as f of s given a, right? Again, borrowing from the information theory literature kind of notationally, right? So f of s given a is f of a union s minus f of a, and this is greater than or equal to f of b union s minus f of b. So this is a kind of diminishing returns property of submodular functions. And a similar property holds for concavity is if a is less than or equal to b, right? And s is greater than 0, then f of a plus s minus f of a is greater than or equal to f of b plus s minus f of b, right? So that's this property that I was talking to you about. That basically, if this value, that is a, is the same, right? When you, sorry, I mean in this case it's s, right? So if s is the same over here, then doing it in a, it will actually give you more gain than doing it in the context of b, right? Any questions until now? Okay. So also if g is a convex function, sorry, if g is a concave function, right? So g basically takes an input as a natural number. I mean, you can define g basically to take an input from a real number to r, right? So r to r. And if f of a is defined as g of size of a, then f of a is submodular if and only if g is concave, right? So if f is defined in this way, that is f a is equal to g of size of a, then you have that you have basically this property, right? So this is the kind of the close connection of submodularity and concavity, that if you have a cardinality based function, right, then you have this if and only if relationship between f and g, right? So if f is submodular, if and only if g is concave. Yes, Professor.
So this way of defining a submodular function, you get a symmetric one. It only depends on the
no, this is not necessarily symmetric, right? So
it only depends on the size. It does not depend on which set.
exactly, this only depends on the size. So an example of this is like the size of square root of a, right?
Now, in some other context, this would be called symmetric.
So typically symmetric submodular functions are functions where f of a is equal to f of v minus a, right?
That's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is membership doesn't matter. For example, in game theory, such a thing would be called symmetric.
Oh, okay, I see. So you're saying that as long as the size is fixed, the value of the function does not change. Yeah, got it. Yeah, thank you. So in fact, you can actually extend this. We spoke about this briefly in the last class as well, that you can extend this to say that f of a is actually equal to g of some modular function of a, right? So here this is modular, right? And essentially instead of cardinality, you just use a modular function of a. And again, you have this relationship, right? That f of a is submodular if g is concave. So such functions are called concave over modular. Okay. Any questions so far? All right. So this is something we'll talk about, in lecture 8. Hopefully, we'll get to lecture 8 towards the end of today. Is that there are two phases of submodularity, right? One phase is the minimization aspect of submodularity. The other phase is the maximization aspect of submodularity, right? And the minimization aspect is kind of akin to the convex aspect, right? And here you kind of draw symmetry or the relationship between submodularity and convexity, right? So this is the relationship between submodularity and convexity, right? And lot of this relationship is exploited in the optimization algorithms for submodular minimization, right? Conversely, you have the relationship between submodularity and concavity, right? And partly, to some extent, this is actually exploited in the maximization literature of submodular functions, right? So this is kind of this nice symmetry and kind of the two faces of submodularity, right? And we'll actually look at this partially to some extent in the when we talk about optimization. Okay. Yeah. All right. So now we will talk about the second part. And actually we are almost done. We are almost done now on the properties. So now we'll actually get to this kind of second part, which is the submodular information measures. But before talking about that, I'll spend maybe 5 minutes talking about some applications of submodularity, kind of before even getting into the optimization, right? Just from a modeling perspective, I think we spoke about this a little bit last time, but I'll still reiterate this a little bit. That what are the scenarios where submodularity makes sense, right? So one application is like data summarization. Right? So imagine that you have, either a lot of images, right? You have like maybe, 10 hundreds of thousands of images, right? And the question is that how do you compute a kind of representative summary of your image collection, right? So that you can capture the key highlights or the key moments of your holiday, for example, right? So this is an aspect where actually submodularity has shown a lot of promise, and there's been a lot of work, in machine learning and kind of information retrieval and many of these communities where kind of summarization has played a role in image where actually submodular functions have shown promise for image summarization, right? The second application is like document summarization, which is useful for NLP. Right? Again, you want to kind of capture the representative sentences within the document, right? So imagine that you have like several news articles, and every day in the morning, CNN will ask you, CNN, or it could be Fox News, or could be anything, right? Whatever you kind of like. It will ask you to kind of get a summary of the current news that is happening, right? And based on, again, your taste and based on what you have seen in the past, it will kind of choose the summary to be kind of aligned with that, right? So here you want to again be representative, right? But also there is this aspect of like importance, right? So this also can be modeled or learned well. So essentially you kind of want to be, you want to figure out what is the kind of news articles that you like, right? Similarly, you have video summarization as another application, right? Another kind of scenario where summarization has been used is data selection, data subset selection, right? An example, one paradigm where this is useful is like kind of time efficient, or maybe time or energy efficient, say deep learning, right? Can we train a deep model on a subset of data, right, while retaining most of the accuracies of deep learning, right? Another application is like memory efficient learning, right? Again, you want to take a subset of the data, but here your goal is memory, so you want a much smaller subset so you can store a smaller memory. Maybe you want to train this on low resource devices, etc., etc., right? Another kind of paradigm of this is like label efficiency. This is related to active learning, right? And we'll actually talk about this when we talk about applications, but I just wanted to mention this to you, right? So in active learning, you want to seek the labels of the data points, right? And you want to find out what is the most representative yet kind of uncertain and most informative set of labels that you can seek, so you can provide that to a human, and then the human can kind of give back the labels to you, right? And that will give you the kind of most gain in terms of the labeling cost, right? So you want to, with a labeling cost or a fixed budget, you want to get as much accuracy as you can, right? So that's this label efficient learning. So the third application is actually feature selection, right? And here, where submodularity has been useful is a couple of aspects here. One is kind of parameter selection, or maybe I'll call this like model compression, right? So this is also related to model compression, by the way, right? So parameter selection for edge devices, right? So imagine you have a deep neural network. It's like a multi-layer, very complex deep model. Can you select a subset of the parameters, subset of the layers, so that you kind of retain a lot of the the accuracy of the model, right? While at the same time ensuring that it runs really fast, right? So this is a feature selection problem. You're selecting a subset of parameters, right? Another application is cost sensitive feature selection, or maybe feature elicitation, right? Where imagine you want to kind of request tests for a kind of clinical, or like for the medical domain, right? Imagine that you have a certain disease, and you want to kind of elicit features, and every time you need to pay a cost for eliciting features, right? So this is cost sensitive learning, where you want to take the cost into account. You want to select as few features as possible, or you basically want to order as few tests as you can, while at the same time getting, making sure that your prediction is not hurt, right? So you don't want to order too many tests, right? So this is what a doctor does when he goes to when he diagnoses patients, right? He finds what is the most optimal test that will kind of answer the current question at hand, but basically will kind of lead to a diagnosis, as effectively as possible. Okay, so there's some questions I think I missed. Are there multiple extensions for convexity? So in fact, we'll talk about one extension, which is the Lowas extension of convexity, and it turns out that it turns out that for any set function, you can actually kind of mathematically compute a convex extension, right? And I'll talk about a few ways that this can be done. But it turns out that if the function is submodular, then this extension can be actually computed very efficiently, right? So that's the nice property of this thing, and this is called the Lowas extension. This was worked by Laszlo Lowas in 1983, where he basically brings up this Lowas extension for submodular functions. Yes, Professor.
So the submodular function was defined on 0, 1 vectors.
Yes.
And we extended it beyond.
Yes.
Maybe you need an extension which is differentiable or twice differentiable. Yes. I don't know whether the Lowas function satisfies such properties. That is the reason why I asked.
Yes, so the Lowas extension is not differentiable. You're right. So Lowas extension is piecewise continuous, right? So essentially, it's kind of it comes out as a polyhedral max, basically, and that's the reason why you're right. It's not smooth and differentiable. So this is one of the limitations of the Lowas extension, which I mean, it's still polynomial time, optimizable, but it's basically 1 over epsilon square, as we saw in the first part, right? So
I thought you're using this for calculus-based algorithms as well, in which case you may need a smooth differentiable extension.
Yeah.
And there may be such functions as well. That's why I'm asking.
Yes, that's true. So from what I know, there is no such general extension that is differentiable, right? So there's no like differentiable convex extension that has been shown yet. I do know that for certain subclasses of functions, you can come up with some extensions that are interesting, either concave or convex. The other thing I'll mention, which is also required for an extension, is that when you're trying to minimize the extension, you want to ensure that the minimum of the extension matches with the minimum of the submodular function, right? So that you don't have an integrality gap. So this is something that actually kind of submodular function that the Lowas extension satisfies. So it might be possible to come up with other smooth extensions, but it would be harder to come up with one that also has this integrality gap property, basically. So yeah, but I think this is anyways an interesting question. Yes.
Let me conjecture that there are such functions because the original set of points is finite, the extension points is infinite, uncountable. I'm sure therefore there are such functions, but we don't know any, I think.
Right, we don't know them yet, and we don't have an efficient algorithm that can compute or find this extension yet. But yeah, this is a great point. So what is the difference between energy efficient and memory efficient DL? Yeah, that's a great question again. Thank you. So time or energy efficient, if you don't care about memory, right, then we can basically, and also we'll talk about this a little bit, we can come up with adaptive algorithms, right, where the subsets adapt over time, right? So if you just care about time or energy efficiency, you can have these subsets changing over iterations, right? As long as you are just using a finite subset every time, right? That's fine. But if you care about memory, then upfront you want to make sure you have a very small subset, right? So essentially over here you are kind of looking at fixed subsets, right? So I think that's the major difference between these two. In principle, they are the same, just that the requirements are slightly different. Are there any other questions on this? Okay, so very quickly, I'll also mention one more application. I think then we'll move on. So this is an application on search, which is also search or recommendation. Right. So the idea here is that can we add kind of diversity to the search? Right. It could be diversity or it could be fairness, etc., etc. Right. So you have so certain times in search. Again, this is kind of a controversial topic today with in machine learning, whether you want machine learning to be fair or not. But I think that this is kind of an important problem in my opinion, because you do want to ensure that your search results kind of can cater to a very broad audience, and you give basically a good representation of the given query you ask for. Like, so for example, I gave this example last time, that if you search for professors in machine learning, you want to be able to see professors from different countries. You want to be able to see professors from different age groups. You want to be able to see professors from different ethnicities, right? You also want to be able to see professors from different sub areas within machine learning, right? So this is where diversity plays a key role, and it's not just enough to give the most famous professors, right? You also want to sometimes give some faculty, some professors who are working on other broader areas in machine learning and kind of have a good coverage, right? So this is another area where actually submodularity and diversity-based models are playing a very effective role. So again, this is just very few of the applications that are there all around us, where so basically submodularity and diversity and all of these are used in machine learning, and this is ever growing. So if any of you are interested in kind of research problems around this, reach out to me, let me know, and we can discuss. But yeah, this is the broad spectrum, right? And now in this part, I'll actually talk about a very recent yet very exciting kind of sub area within submodularity. Again, talking about it from a modeling perspective, which I call submodular information measures. And this is not new. Kind of aspects of this have been looked at, right since Shannon in 1948, and several other kind of papers, in the late 90s, early 2000s, etc. A lot of work in information theory along these lines, right? But in some sense, the kind of connections to machine learning are recent, and a lot of work actually was done on this by by our group and some collaborators, where we have been looking at kind of these submodular information measures, kind of concepts of submodular mutual information, conditional gain, and so on and so forth, right? So I'll spend some time talking about this as well. And I also want to kind of just briefly mention that I'm going to ask one of my students who's actually working on kind of a nice toolkit for submodular optimization. So I'm going to ask him to to actually record a lecture, or to be put on YouTube, where he will be actually giving some hands-on demo of submodularity in practice, right? In action. And you'll be able to see this demo, and also the toolkit is coming out soon. It's almost it's almost ready and almost done. I would definitely encourage you to play with it, and you will definitely learn a lot by playing around with these things. I won't spend the class time to actually go over this demo, but I'll ask him to record a separate lecture that you can hear offline, right? So most probably this will be done in the next week. All right. So we spoke about the modeling aspects of submodular functions, right? And we kind of argued informally that submodular functions are information functions. Well, why are they information functions? Because they capture kind of notions of information of a set of kind of data points, right? Imagine you have a set of images, and you want to try to understand what is the information content in this images, right? What does information mean even? Well, there are multiple ways you can define information. One way to define information is through the concept of defining this as random variables and understanding the entropy of random variables, right, or the uncertainty. And this is one way of capturing information, but you have other ways of capturing information as well, right? And these other ways of capturing information are what we have been exploring. So for example, one way you can capture information, which is kind of albeit slightly deterministic, as opposed to the entropic or the kind of information theoretic viewpoint of this, is where you can kind of view information as a set of concepts, right? Imagine you have multiple scenes over here. Imagine you have multiple objects that are there in images, right? So here you have a sofa, you have some trees, you have the carpet. You want to capture all of these as information, right? When a human sees this, he kind of captures this kind of visually as, kind of different things the image is trying to convey, right? Or different aspects the video is trying to convey. So we also argued that naturally submodular functions are kind of natural information functions, right? Why is this? Because as you grow these subset, as you have larger and larger subsets, there is a larger chance of there being redundancy, right? So the information gain reduces as you have larger subsets. So this is something we saw already. I think many of you have kind of understood this by now. The other aspect is that entropic functions are naturally submodular, right? So we know that this is the diminishing returns property of a submodular function, right? And we also know from mutual information, or sorry, from entropy and information theory, that information never hurts, right? So you compute the information gain or the conditional information of the entropy of x of a union e minus the entropy of x of a, right? And you define this as the entropy of xe given xa, right? Then what we know is that as the size of the as the context of the sets grow, the gain of adding this will shrink, right? So what this means is that basically the conditional kind of entropy of x of e given xa is less than the conditional entropy of sorry, this should be actually greater than, this is a typo. So this is greater than equal to the conditional entropy of x of e given x of b, right? So as a is a subset of b, basically you have this diminishing returns property, right? So it turns out that if you have a subset, so if you have given random variables x1, x2 until xn, right, and you have a subset a as basically belonging to 1 to n, right? So this notation here, n is basically nothing but 1 to until n, right? So a being a subset from 1 to n, then for any subset a, you are defining now x of a as the set of random variables which are defined with respect to a, right? So can additional information confuse rather than clarify? So let's see. So that's actually a good question, and slightly more kind of philosophical from a modeling perspective. So I think what you really care about is what is the problem you're trying to model, right? So we know that from an entropic perspective, if you look at information from an information theoretic or from an entropic perspective, we know that basically we kind of have this property, right? That as you have larger and larger sets, the gain of adding more information shrinks, right? So there's a diminishing returns in information. So when you are saying that can additional information confuse rather than clarify, what I think you are saying is that as you get more information, the amount of information somehow shrinks because you have certain kind of confusing aspects, right? Or what's the word I'm looking for? Yes.
So what I'm thinking is there are multiple agents.
Yes.
And what you think is information coming from a different agent might be a deliberate attempt to confuse you.
Yes.
That's the kind of thing that I'm thinking about.
I see. So yeah, that's a great question. So I think the confusing aspect though, right, is more related to the monotonicity of the function, right? So I think one way is to think of it from an adversarial perspective, right? Or what I think, I mean, it could be noise, that could be one aspect, but it could also be deliberate, which is like an adversarial, like an adversary, right? And I think that's what you mean over here. So I think both of these aspects are actually interesting directions. I don't know about literature that has been studied this, but to me, from a modeling perspective, this seems to be more from a monotonicity perspective, right? Because as you're adding information, right, in this kind of multi-agent scenario, possibly, you could be getting some information that is noisy or that is adversarial. So imagine that you have a particular agent, then given with respect to this agent, you're adding some points that that are actually adversarial, right? And by adding adversarial points, you could somehow this could be worse. So if you think of it from a machine learning perspective, imagine that you're adding kind of data points for training a classifier, right? But if you add adversarial points, these adversarial points could possibly hurt you, or maybe out of distribution points, right? So from that perspective, I still think that the submodularity would hold, right? But that would actually essentially not satisfy monotonicity. So in such cases, the loss function or the accuracy function, right, of say the machine learning model over data set size, right, or over over the data itself, or the set of data, may not be monotone. But I still think that it would be submodular. Yes.
As you know, I have an axe to grind about bisubmodular functions. So I'm thinking
Yes.
in terms of bisubmodularity, where a 2% information set is coming in.
Yes, absolutely. That's actually great. And I do know papers. There is one particular paper called bisubmodular maximization, where they actually do this from an mutual information perspective, right? And they actually show that you can consider the joint mutual information between A and B, right? So you have like the mutual information XA, XB between two subsets, right? And they show that under certain conditions in terms of A and B, this is actually bisubmodular. So I think this has been studied, but I think this is a great direction and a great question, that you can look at kind of submodularity, and also there are notions, by the way, of multi-submodularity, right? And essentially multi-submodularity is kind of studying notions of submodularity over multiple subsets and kind of jointly optimizing over multiple subsets. Yes, Nathan.
Yeah, so actually that's what I was just about to ask about. How do you define a bisubmodular function? Or I guess in the more general case, the multi-submodular.
There are actually, that's a great question. So that would be a separate course in itself. Unfortunately, I won't have time to go over it in a lot of detail, but maybe I can give a slight detour and talk about two ways that bisubmodular functions, and in fact, maybe Professor Chandrasekharan can in fact add over here. So from what I remember, right, in fact, this extends to multi-submodular as well. So there are multiple kind of variants in which bisubmodularity has been defined. So essentially, a bisubmodular function, broadly speaking, is a function where you're talking about two sets now, right? And you're trying to understand what are properties that make optimization over two sets efficient. Okay. So one case is what is known as a simple bisubmodularity, if I remember right. Right. Yes. And the second one is actually called the second one, if I remember right, is called directed bisubmodularity. I'm not 100% sure on this. Right. So the simple bisubmodularity is basically where you're assuming A and B belong to 4 raised to B, right? So what I mean by 4 raised to B is that you consider any possible subsets A and B, right? Whereas in the directed case, you make an additional assumption that A and B do not intersect, right? And in this simple bisubmodularity case, I think the definition, if I remember right, is that you require f of A union E, right, comma B union E minus f of A comma B to be greater than or equal to f of A prime union E comma B prime union E minus f of A prime B prime, right? Again, this is a little bit confusing because there are multiple. So this is the standard diminishing returns way, right? So this is like the diminishing returns variant of bisubmodularity, and it turns out that if you satisfy the diminishing returns, then you also satisfy the union intersection version, but not vice versa, right? So in the directed bisubmodularity, I think you require the union intersection version, that is f of A comma B plus f of C comma D is greater than or equal to f of A union C comma B union D plus f of A intersection C comma B intersection D. Something like this. So Professor, do you remember, is this correct? I don't remember at the top of my head.
Correct. The second one is how we started.
Yes, exactly. And there has been some extensions on the simple bisubmodularity as well later on, though I think this one is kind of slightly more interesting. But I think what I do remember, hopefully if memory is serving me right, is that it's not anymore the case that this definition is equivalent to this definition, right? So in the kind of the bisubmodularity world, these two are different. I can point you to some papers which go into this in more detail. But yeah, this is kind of a nice emerging sub area of studying bisubmodularity and multi-submodular optimization. Also, by the way, multi-submodularity is where you define subsets over like k different sets. Okay. All right. So we'll come back now to the information theoretic concepts. So again, the entropy of a set of random variables, this we know is submodular. This is the standard information, right? So this is the information. And then we have the mutual information, right? So this is the joint information between two sets, x of A and x of B. And this is defined as h of xa plus h of xb minus h of xa union b, right? So essentially, h of xa union b is nothing but xa and xb, right? So you're taking like the joint entropy. You're taking the joint entropy between A and B. Okay. Sure. Yeah. Thanks. All right. So the other. So this is basically the joint information. Okay. The third is the conditional entropy, right? And the conditional entropy is the entropy of h of xa given xb, right? And this is nothing but h of xa comma xb, which is the joint entropy minus h of xb, right? So this is essentially also called conditional information, right? And finally, we have the conditional mutual information, right? Which is the mutual information between A and B conditioned on C, right? And this is nothing but the conditional entropy h of xa given xc plus h of xb given xc minus h of xa comma xb, right? This is the joint entropy conditioned on C. Okay, so this is the conditional joint information. It's conditioned on C, but joint with respect to A and B. Any questions on this? Okay. So now this is where this gets a little interesting, right? Again, I'll just talk about this at a high level, but very early on, right, in the 1940s and the 1950s, actually Shannon came up with 3 properties that an information function should satisfy, right? So he called it the entropy function, but actually this is any information function, right? So any information function f over subsets A and B over random variables, right? But this could also be over any, over data points. right, should satisfy three properties. So the first one is that the function should be normalized, right? That if I have no data, right, the information should be zero. I should have zero information if I have nothing, right? Which makes sense. The second property is monotonicity, which means that as I add more and more data, my information should only increase, right? And the third property is what he called the two alternative, right, or submodularity. And he basically said that this should satisfy f of a plus f of b greater than or equal to f of a union b plus f of a intersection b. Interestingly, at that time, Shannon, so this is like Shannon, the kind of father of information theory, right? At that time, Shannon was not aware of the term submodularity, probably, right? I mean, submodularity was there in the math community, as early on as the 30s and 40s. But it turns out that Shannon maybe did not know about the term submodularity, but he independently came up with this concept, what he called as two alternatives, right? And kind of an interesting observation is that property 3 directly implies the non-negativity of the mutual information and the conditional mutual information, right? So the submodularity is critical for the mutual information and conditional mutual information to be non-negative, right? And properties 1 and 2 actually imply the non-negativity of entropy and conditional entropy, okay? Yeah, so in the case of adversarial, whatever we discussed before, you're right. So if you do consider kind of adversarial data and you consider information from that perspective, then yes, maybe monotonicity would not be satisfied. That's why actually submodular functions are not necessarily monotone, right? A special class of submodular functions are monotone. So we do want to model non-monotonicity in several applications, and you're absolutely right that there will be scenarios where actually such information functions are possibly non-monotone, right? But at least the standard Shannon information actually is monotone. Now, actually, I'll say one more thing, that when you have continuous random variables, it's not necessary that your functions, your entropy functions are monotone, right? So think of, for example, the entropy of a Gaussian random variable, right? The entropy of a Gaussian random variable actually can be non-monotone, and in fact, it can even be non-negative in certain cases, right? It depends a lot on the kind of covariance matrix of your Gaussian distribution, right? So the entropy of a Gaussian distribution is actually nothing but the log determinant function. So if you recall, we spoke about this class of function, right, which is the log determinant of S of A, which also relates to a determinantal point processes, DPP, right? So this is sorry, there's some lag that comes sometimes. I'm actually using Meet, so I'm kind of using, a kind of roundabout way to share my slides, because like as I was saying, somehow the QuickTime player was not working for me today, like last minute. Anyways, so this log determinant function actually is non-monotone, right? So there are cases even in information theory where entropy is not necessarily monotone or positive, but that is more for continuous random variables. If you have discrete random variables, then the entropy is always will always satisfy all these three properties. Any questions on this so far? Okay, so this was also called Shannon inequalities, right? This is in the information theory community. These three inequalities are called Shannon inequalities. Okay. Now, it turns out that a polymatroid function is exactly the function which satisfies these three inequalities, right? So the first is normalization, right? The fact that the function is normalized, the fact that the function is monotone, and the fact it's submodular, right? So polymatroid functions generalize entropy. And what Shannon did know at that time is what's the relationship between general polymatroid functions and entropy functions, right? Are they equal, right? Or is it the case that entropy is a subset of polymatroid functions? So, any questions on this so far? Okay, so maybe I'll talk about this slide first, and then I'll talk about the other things. So in maybe around 97, 98, for the first time, this is actually a kind of nice seminal work by Zhang and Jung. Both of these are transactions of information theory papers, right? Right. So these are all transactions papers where basically what they showed for the first time is that entropy is a strict subset of polymatroid functions. Okay. So what this means is that there are certain polymatroid functions where you cannot define any probability distribution such that the entropy of these random variables is equal to this polymatroid function. Right. So what this means is that entropy is a strict subclass of polymatroid functions. And in fact, the way he showed it is kind of a nice mathematical proof technique. He showed that entropic measures, right, or entropy functions admit certain inequalities, right, which are not satisfied by which cannot be shown by just the Shannon inequalities, right? What this means, in other words, is that there are certain polymatroid functions. So there exist polymatroid functions f such that these inequalities, and by these I mean, these certain inequalities, right, are violated. Okay. So one such inequality, right, which holds for all convex combinations of entropic functions is given four random variables x1, x2, x3, x4, right? There is this very weird looking asymmetric inequality, okay, which entropic functions capture. And this can be extended, by the way, to like subsets of random variables, right? And in fact, general polymatroid functions don't satisfy this, right? In fact, there are actually certain, so actually this is wrong. So actually when I kind of wrote this slide last year, I thought that even facilitation and set cover don't satisfy this, but it turns out that actually set cover and facilitation are in fact subsets of entropy. This is something we showed actually like early this year. But in fact, there are certain matroid rank functions, right? Again, I've not kind of gone into a lot of details on what matroid rank functions are, but I kind of went over it at a high level that these are in some sense something like the matrix rank functions. So there are certain matroid rank functions that that do not satisfy this. So could you okay, could you show the definition of polymatroid again, which Shannon inequality could be violated? I see. So this is the three definitions of polymatroid functions, right? Was this your question? Okay. Yeah. So these are the three properties, right? One is normalization, monotonicity, and the two alternatives, which is submodularity. And the proof is actually complicated, so I'm not going to go over the proof right now. But you can actually show that there exists a submodular function which satisfies these three properties, right? But it doesn't satisfy this inequality. Okay. So in fact, maybe I'll actually talk about this again. This is by the way a completely open research problem, which I'm very interested in. So if any of you is interested in this space, slightly more theoretical, but wants to explore this kind of connection between information theory and submodularity, properties of submodular functions, etc., let me know. We can discuss this. I'm actually looking for a student who's interested in this space. So just kind of an advertisement here. But basically the problem is as follows, right? So imagine you have the space of all polymatroid functions, right? So what we know so far is that entropy functions are actually subclasses, right? So this is So actually, maybe I will call this actually closure of entropy. So what I mean by closure of entropy is that given an entropic function h1 and h2, right, lambda of h1 plus 1 minus lambda of h2. So if h1 and h2 belong to this closure of entropy, right, maybe I'll call it hc or hcl, right, then this function also belongs to the closure of entropy, right. So reason why I'm saying this is closure of entropy is because entropy is actually an open set, it turns out, right. So there are actually certain very simple functions that that don't belong to the closure of entropy. And again, this is actually there in this Zhang and Jung's 1997-98 paper. Okay. So within the closure of entropy, you have this somewhat open set, right, which is entropy. Right. Now, I think one interesting characterization is that what classes of polymetroid functions fall within entropy and which do not, right? I think this is a very interesting theoretical question. It turns out that the facilitation function actually lies within this, right? It also turns out that the set cover function also lies within this, right? It turns out that there is a simple function which is a truncation. So maybe I'll use another color here. Right, so a simple function which is a truncation, which actually turns out to be nothing but like a multiplied by minimum of size of x comma 2, right? So it's a very simple truncation function that does not belong to entropy but belongs to the closure of entropy, right? But I think it's so far, and also what is known is that there are certain matroid rank functions that belong to polymetroid functions but not to entropy, right? But I think in general it's pretty open as to what's the characterization of other functions here, right? And I think this is an interesting research direction which I just want to briefly mention here on basically characterizing submodular functions in this information theoretic landscape, right? All right, but I think we can actually come back now. So any questions on this so far? Okay. So now having defined this, right, we can come up with this generalization concept, right? So right now it's just a mathematical concept, so just bear with me, right? But the idea is as follows. So submodular functions, or what I'm calling submodular information functions, are nothing but basically submodular functions or like polymetroid functions over subsets, right? So given a set A of items, you can define f of A, where f is a polymetroid function, right? So this is the standard submodular information function, okay? But you can also define now what we call as a submodular mutual information, right? And the submodular mutual information is this joint information, right, between A and B. So A and B are two subsets of items, right? They could intersect or they may not intersect. And given the subsets of items, I have f of A plus f of B minus f of A union B. Okay. So right now, this is just a mathematical expression, right? Just a mathematical property that you can define such a quantity, which is basically this quantity, which is if of A comma B. Okay. You can similarly also define this notion of conditional gain, which is f of A given B, right? And this is nothing but f of A union B minus f of B, right? And finally, you can define this conditional mutual information, right? Which is if of A comma B given C, which is f of A given C plus f of B given C minus f of A union B given C, right? So far all I've done is that I've taken this entropic quantities and extended this to submodular functions, right? So given any arbitrary submodular function, we can actually define these three terms, which is the submodular mutual information, submodular conditional gain, and the conditional submodular mutual information. Okay. Any questions on this so far? All right. So what is the intuition here? Okay. So the first one is just the information function, right? So this is kind of information content in a set A. Okay. So so this is just a submodular information, right? So this is clear from the name. Then you have the submodular conditional gain, which is the gain in the information when I add a set A to a set B, right? So I have an existing set B, right? And now I'm trying to add this A to B, right? When I add A to B, what is the additional information that A brings to B? So that's what the submodular conditional gain is, right? The submodular mutual information is the joint information between A and B, right? So I have two sets A and B. What is the joint or the shared information, right? So this is in some sense the shared or the joint information. Now the beauty of this, as we will see very soon, is that what we mean by the shared information or what we mean by the joint information actually depends on the specific submodular function at hand. Okay. So, so I think that this is kind of a very interesting, framework of studying these functions, and we will look at a few instances of what we mean by shared information, right? So just hold on, even if you don't understand everything, that's fine. We'll make things a little bit more concrete soon. Okay. Finally, there is this one more interesting concept called independence. Okay. And what I mean by independence is kind of similar to the statistical independence, but I'm calling this combinatorial independence. And what we mean by combinatorial independence here is that we have two subsets A and B, and we are trying to achieve maximally different subsets A and B in terms of F, right? So essentially, what we mean here is that the joint information between A and B must be 0. Okay. So it doesn't necessarily mean that A and B are disjoint, right? A and B could be disjoint, but yet they could share some joint information. Okay. So we just don't mean that they are disjoint. We mean that they actually do not share any information. Again, things are a little bit vague right now, and they are, I mean, intentionally so, because I am kind of, kind of building this up a little bit. But we will, but I'll make this kind of concrete soon when we go over some examples. Okay. All right. So this is independence, right? And we say that two subsets A and B are independent, and this is the notation that I use for independence, which is A independent B, A being independent of B with respect to F, right? If and only if the joint information IF of A comma B is actually equal to 0. Okay. And similarly, we say that given sets A, B, C, A is conditionally independent of B given C, if and only if IF of A comma B given C is equal to 0. Okay. So the above notions of independence or joint independence imply pairwise independence, it turns out, right? So what I mean by pairwise independence here is that two sets, right? So this, again, recall we are dealing with sets. So two sets A and B are independent or like joint independence, jointly independent, sorry, if this is true, right? So it turns out that this also means that they are pairwise independent in the sense that I take any individual element A within this larger set A and I take any element B within this larger set B, right? And A is, sorry, A is basically independent with B, right? For all A in A and B in B. So this is what we call pairwise independence. Okay. So it turns out that this combinatorial independence actually generalizes kind of the standard independence between subsets of random variables, right? Any questions on this so far? So again, like I promised that very soon we will see some concrete examples, and things will hopefully become very clear when you see it in the context of some examples. Okay. So next we also can define a kind of multi-set information content, right, or like multi-set information. So the way we do this is, given sets A1 to AK, right, we can define two kinds of mutual information measures, right. One is the submodular total correlation, which is CF of A1 to AK, and this is actually defined as this term, right, which is sum of I from 1 to k, f of ai minus f of union I ai. Okay, so this term is actually nothing but a1 union a2 union ak, right? So it's a union of everything. So this is like the generalization of mutual information, but extended to k sets. So I'm taking a sum of this, right, minus the complete union. Okay. So this is one version of this, which is called total correlation. The other one is the multi-set mutual information. Okay, and this one actually is slightly more complicated, but you can think of it as an inclusion-exclusion kind of definition, right? Because what's going on here is that we take a sum, right? So I take a sum, sorry, a sum of I from 1 to k, f of ai, right? And then I take a difference of like pairs, like of ij, and then like maybe I not equal to j, right? Of f of a I union aj, right? Plus all possible triplets. And so on and so forth, right? So I'm taking all subsets of a certain size k, right? I'm taking all subsets of 1 to k, right? And I'm taking this union with respect to t of f of ai, and note that there is this inclusion exclusion thing, right? So every alternating term there is this minus and this plus. So in some sense this goes in between this, because what this is saying is that you're just taking the first and the last term, right? Here we are using the intermediate ones, but we are adding and subtracting. Okay. So this is another notion of a multi-set mutual information. And by the way, this extends in the mutual information case. There is this notion of multi-set not multi-set. I think it's called multi mutual information or something like that. I can't remember exactly. So there are these two notions in the standard kind of mutual information literature as well, where you can define mutual information between k random variables, right? And this is what this concept is, but extended to k sets. Okay. All right. So this is just an intuition of the mutual information. So kind of from a Venn diagram perspective, you have this sets A and B, and then you have A, right? This region A, which I'm marking, over here in this Venn diagram, right, is actually the f of A given B, right? This region is the if of A comma B, right, which is this. This is this, right? And the other one is this, right? Okay, so you have three kind of concepts over here. One is f of A given B. The second is basically if of A comma B, and the third is f of B given A. Okay, similarly, you can define this with three sets. You have many more things over here. So you have A, which is only this region, is if of A given B comma C, right? This region is nothing but if of B given A comma C, and so on and so forth. The region D over here is actually if, so the joint information between A and B conditioned on C, right? So this is this conditional mutual information. So D, E, and F are the conditional mutual informations, and G here is the multi-set mutual information. that we spoke about. So this one, right, with 3 random variables. So essentially, we can kind of come up with this Venn diagramic way of viewing these mutual information quantities over multiple sets. Is this clear to guys? I think there's a lot of silence, not too many questions. So I just want to make sure, like everyone is following. Yeah, Nathan.
Yeah, so in the example for k equals 2, can you explain why the conditioning each one of those on the other corresponds to the shaded areas?
Oh, I see. Okay. So when you look at this region, so when you look at a Venn diagram, right? Typically, there is this inclusion-exclusion thing, right? So what this area means, so this green area, right, means that I'm taking the information of A, right, but I'm subtracting out the information of B, right? So one way you can view this from an information theoretic perspective, right, is that I take the complete information, which is f of A union B, right, which is also basically, you can also call this f of A comma B, not necessarily from a joint or like a bi-submodular perspective, but from an information perspective, right? So this is the joint information between A and B, right, minus the information of B. Okay. So again, this Venn diagram is more of a construct to try to understand what these different regions are. I would not, go necessarily by, that this is exactly this case, because from one perspective you can also analyze, you can also try to argue that, this is f of A minus B, right? So by the way, like one thing I want to kind of make clear, that if A is submodular, f of A minus B, which is a set difference, is not equal to f of A conditioned on B, right? Because f of A minus B is that you're subtracting out B from A and you're taking it on a difference, right? But what this really is that this is the extra information in A after you have removed the information from B, right? So that's why I'm kind of talking about this view, which is f of A given B over here, because you're taking the joint information from A and B, but you're subtracting out all the information of B. So you're left with this extra information that A contains, which is not in B. Does that answer your question, Nathan?
Yeah. I just need to look at the definition for conditional gain. It makes sense now.
Okay, awesome. So how is f of A minus B? Okay, so f of A minus B is just applying the submodular function of the set difference, right? Does it make sense, Atrish? So imagine A is equal to 1, 2, 3, 5, 9, and B is equal to 2, 5, right? So A minus B is actually the set, which is the set difference between these two, right? Which is 1, 3, 9, right? And then I just apply f on A minus B on this set, right? So it's f of this set, whereas f of A given B is actually f of this minus, it's actually the union of this. And so in this case, so maybe I'll make this a little bit more complicated, right? So let's say this is 2, 5, 10, 11, right? So A minus B is 1, 3, 9, right? Is this clear to everyone? Right? But basically f of A minus B would be f of 1, 3, 9, right? Whereas f of A given B would actually be f of the intersection, which is 1, 2, 3, 5, 9, 10, 11, minus f of 2, 5, 10, 11. Right, so this is 5, by the way. I think I also got confused. So this is 5. Okay, is this part clear? Why these two are different? If f is modular, then this is exactly the same, right? But if since f is submodular, these two are not the same. Okay, so this is a set difference. This is a minus b, and this is a condition dot b. Okay, so there are two. Isn't that the union? So isn't what the union? Yeah. So this term is the union over here. So this is f of a union b minus f of b. Yes. 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 Yeah. Sounds good. Any other questions? Okay. All right. So I think we'll go over some examples. So I just delay the break a little bit because I think in maybe 10-15 minutes we'll be done. Then we can take a 5-minute break and then I'll get started on the optimization part, right? So let's go over some concrete examples. So the simplest case is where you have an additive function, right? And the additive function is not really interesting, is obvious. And in fact, you have obvious interpretations of all of these, right? The first case, f of a is nothing but w of a, right? Which is just by definition, right? F of a condition b on b, right? So this is the conditional information, is nothing but a set difference, right? So here conditioning is equal to set difference only in the modular case. So here this is w of a minus b, okay? if of a comma b is equal to w of a intersection b, right? Again, because it's modular, mutual information is equal to intersection. Okay, if of a1 to ak is equal to w of the intersection of ai's, right? And finally, independence implies that a intersection b. So here, by the way, we assume that the modular function is greater than 0 everywhere, right? So the independence implies that a intersection b is equal to the empty set. So a and b are independent if they are disjoint. Okay. So modular function is the simplest case, not really interesting, right? Because there is no real notion of shared information, right? Everything is additive. But nevertheless, it's easy to understand what these mean over here. Okay. By the way, a modular function is exactly equal to an entropy function, right? With in the independent random variables, right? So if you have x1, x2 until xk, which are all independent, then essentially what you have is the entropy of xa is nothing but going to be the sum of I in a h of xi because it's independent, right? So what is w of a? So w of a is the modular function, right? So w of a is nothing but the sum of I in a wi. Okay, so sorry, maybe I didn't define this earlier. We saw this briefly last time when we defined modular function, but I should have recapped it. So this is a modular function, right? Any questions? Yes, Nathan.
Yeah, so something that's not entirely clear to me is we saw earlier that we had a class of functions for entropy, but here I thought the thing that's not like sitting clear with me is I thought entropy was defined a particular way. So why now are we constituting a class of functions that we refer to as entropy whenever there was just one definition that was given? That part's not clear to me.
So if I understand your question, you are saying that why are we calling an entropy function a class of functions where there's only one function? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah, so the reason why I'm calling entropy functions a class of functions is because you can define the distribution in any arbitrary way, right? And for any distribution, you basically parameterized by the distribution, you get a different kind of entropy function. So you're right, entropy is one function, right? But it changes with the way you define the distribution over random variables, right?
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. Any other questions? If f then would yes, you're right. So if a and b are disjoint, then f of a conditioned on b would nothing but be equal to f of a, right? Because the set difference between a minus b would be a, because b doesn't contain anything that is in a, right? Yeah, you're right. Right. So the question basically is that if a intersection b is equal to the empty set, then f of a given b is equal to f of a, right? Okay. Okay, so we'll look at a little bit. We'll go make it a little bit more complex, and I think this, hopefully this example and a few others will kind of convince you that this is useful, right? And this is interesting. So what's going on now is, let's define this as a set cover. Okay, so set cover also is a very simple function. Recall that you define gamma a as the kind of coverage, right? As the union of I in A of ui, right? So essentially for every item I, right, I have this u1, u2, and so on, right? So u1 is a set of concepts. So sorry, I don't mean it here. U1 is a set of concepts that each of these cover, right? So for example, the first document, okay, the first document covers cat and beach, right? Could be more. Let's just take this as an example, right? Second one covers dog, and so on and so forth, right? So you take these individual concepts that are covered by these UIs, right, and define the union coverage as union of I in A of ui, right? And this is this gamma a. So this is a coverage, and then you can define f of a to be w of gamma a, right? So I have my w function here, which is defined on the concept space. So w is defined in this space. Okay. So now, given this, actually we have very interesting kind of interpretations of this, right? So the conditional kind of entropy, or the conditional information here of f of a given b, is actually equal to w of gamma a minus gamma b, right? So this is different, by the way. So this is not equal to w of gamma of a minus b. This is not the same, right? What I'm saying is that this is gamma a minus gamma b. So I look at the concepts covered by both. So a and b could be very different, but I'm seeing what are the joint concepts between this, and I'm removing the joint concepts in the conditional gain. Okay. So to make things very concrete, imagine that I have one which covers, like, say, cat, beach, person, right? I have two which covers beach, person, and I have three which covers dog, beach, right? For now, let's just assume that we have three, right? So now, so if I define this quantity, which is f of 3 given 1, right? So 3 and 1 are disjoint, right? Because 3 is one document, sorry, 1 is document 1, 3 is document 3, is disjoint in the sense that these two elements themselves have nothing in common, right? Because both of these are singleton sets. So this is A and this is B. The sets A and B themselves are disjoint, okay? But when you look at it from a set cover perspective, this function is going to be gamma of the set difference between 3 and 1, right? And this set difference is actually dog, right? So the additional information that 3 has, which is not in 1, is dog, right? So this is the kind of interesting aspect that the set cover and kind of looking at these functions from a set cover perspective brings us, right? Now, what's the joint information? The joint information is this w of gamma a intersection gamma b, right? So I take the intersection between these two. The intersection between these two is beach, right? So these two sets share this beach concept, and is the shared information now between these two sets of quantities. So of course you can define, you can extend this now to like where A and B are sets of multiple quantities, and that's where this becomes a little bit more interesting. Okay. Similarly, independence here is when gamma A and gamma B don't have anything in common. So again, I'll emphasize this fact again, that A and B may be disjoint, right? Even if A and B are disjoint, still there can be some shared information between A and B, because we are not looking at the set of items anymore. We are looking at the concepts that these items represent, right? And we are looking at shared information in this concept space. All right, I'll quickly look at some other examples. Again, this is actually also interesting. You have the facility location function, which is like sum of I and B, max of A, this standard. I mean, just looking at the representations, right? We saw this last time. We can define the conditional gain here, and the conditional gain basically says that for every item I in V, I see whether I'm basically trying to see whether is there anything in A that represents the item I better than what B already represents it, right? If there is something that represents it better, then there is a conditional gain. Otherwise, for that particular item I am already saturated, right? My gain is 0 for that item I. Okay. So that's why is the max of the difference between these two things. Sorry, there's actually a delay over here. So sorry about that. Somehow it's not optimal, but I think it's okay. Similarly, the joint information between A and B, right, is nothing but this minimum is the sum of I and V, and it's a minimum amongst the representations. So it's max of A in A of SIA, comma max of B in B of SIB, right? And you're taking the minimum between these two. And finally, also you have this multi-set information, which is like this multi-set minimum, right? So this also is an interesting kind of mathematical expression. Yeah. Similarly, you can do it for a few other functions. It turns out that for a graph cut function, this mutual information is nothing but the cut between A and B, right? So the sum of I in A, sum of J in B of Sij. And in fact, if of A comma V minus A is exactly the graph cut function, right? And here A and B are independent if between A and B there is no joint similarity. Okay. Also, there is this expression for probabilistic coverage, which maybe in the interest of time I'll skip, but I'll just mention like the joint. I'll just talk about this term. So this term is, recall that the probabilistic set cover is this, Wi of 1 minus pi of A, right? So this term is nothing but pi of A over here, right? And then what I'm doing is that I'm actually multiplying for every I in U, I'm multiplying by Wi 1 minus pi of A multiplied by 1 minus pi of B, right? So this is just a probabilistic interpretation of this same thing, right? But I think this also kind of the probabilistic kind of concept space, it captures this nice joint information between two sets A and B. Okay, so I'll talk about a few properties. Many of them follow directly from definitions, so they are relatively simple. So if f is a polymatroid function, then you have the non-negativity, right? So f of A given B, if of A comma B, and if of A comma B given C. So all of these information theoretic concepts are non-negative. Okay. You also have monotonicity. So f of A and f of A given B are monotone in A for a fixed B. The joint information is monotone in A for a fixed B and vice versa, right? This is also symmetric, by the way. So it means that if of A comma B is actually equal to if of B comma A, right? So it's symmetric. And if of A comma B given C is monotone in A for a fixed B and C, right? And similarly, it's monotone in B for a fixed A and C. Finally, we have some lower bound properties. So we have 0 is less than equal to f of A given B is less than equal to f of A. And then, you have this bound on if of A comma B, right? So this intersection, the information contained by the intersection is actually less than the mutual information, which in turn is less than minimum of f of a comma f of b, right? So this is kind of this nice inequality that connects these different concepts over here. Similarly, you can write this down for the mutual information. I mean the conditional mutual information. Sorry. Okay. Any questions on this so far? Yes, Harsha. I can't hear you actually. Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Where will the in the Venn diagram, where will the submodular functions lie? So I'm assuming, are you talking about this Venn diagram? Oh, I see. That's fine. Yeah, so the submodular functions, well, so this region over here, right? This region is actually f of a, right? So this is the information content in f of a, and this region is actually f of b. The one with polymatroid and entropic closure. Oh, I see. So are you talking about this one? Okay. So actually, okay. So submodular functions are actually more broader, because in general for submodular functions, so submodular functions are a richer class, mainly because, so this is like submodularity, right? Because submodularity just has the third inequality, which is the two, so we just require the f of a plus f of b greater than or equal to f of a union b plus f of a intersection b, right? Polymatroid functions additionally also have normalization and monotonicity, right? So like a lot of this area comprises of non-normalized functions and non-monotone functions. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Can we say that f of a given b is less than or equal to f of a? Yes, I believe that's true. So I think what you are saying, so basically what you're saying is that f of a union b minus f of b, right, is less than or equal to f of a minus b, and that's actually a great point, because which in turn is actually less than or equal to so in fact this is in fact less than or equal to minimum of no, sorry, yeah, no, so yeah, you're right. So basically f of a union b minus f of b is less than or equal to f of a minus b. Yes, and the reason is because of submodularity, because when you take this to the other side, right, you have f of a union b, and the union of these two is nothing but f of a union b, right? So just from submodularity you get that the union and the intersection of these two is 0, because because b and a minus b don't intersect by definition, right? So just by the union intersection property, this holds. Similarly, you also have that f of a union b minus f of a is actually less than or equal to f of b minus a. Yeah, thanks, Krishna. Anything else? Okay, so I think we are almost done. I will talk about the submodularity of the mutual information also, right? So a slight detour. So we have that first order partial derivatives are non-negative. Basically what this means is that f of I given a is equal to f of a union I minus f of a is equal to 0 if the function is monotone, right? Submodularity says that the second order partial derivative, which is f of I comma j given a, which is nothing but f of I given a union j minus f of I given a, this is less than or equal to 0 if the for the function to be submodular, right? So this property implies submodularity. So there's actually a subclass of submodular functions where we additionally require the third order partial derivative to be non-negative, right? Which basically can be written as this. It turns out that multiple subclasses of functions like set cover, facilitation, concave over modular, certain concave over modular functions like with power and log functions, they satisfy this, right? But even a simple truncation like minimum of size of a comma k, it turns out does not satisfy this, right? If for this subclass of functions, it turns out that both of these are actually submodular in A for a fixed B and C. So in general, IF of A comma B is not submodular in A for a fixed B, right? But if this certain property holds, which is the third order partial derivative being non-negative, then it is actually submodular, right? And in general, is actually a difference of submodular functions. So yeah, So I think with this, I'm almost done. I'm actually done with this part. Are there any questions on this right now? If not, we can take a quick 5-minute break and we'll start with lecture 8. Yeah, so is this an if and only if condition? I believe it's an if and only if condition. So it's an if and only if condition for the submodularity of IF of A comma B. Yes, I think, yeah, we showed that it's an if and only if condition. So if so basically IF of A comma B is submodular in A for a fixed B and C if and only if the third order partial derivatives are non-negative. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? All right. So let's take a quick break and let's kind of resume on the optimization part after the break. All right.